On the morning of December 3, 1942, a reconnaissance flight from Henderson Field returned with photographs that at first seemed ordinary, just swaying palm trees. But for the Allied analysts, something was off. The shadows didn't match the trees, and the angles hinted at something unnatural. Under magnification, they spotted it, hidden beneath a carefully arranged lattice of cables, fronds, and camouflage netting was a man-made structure, nearly 6,000 feet long and 90% complete. If it was what they feared, the lives of the 58,000 American troops fighting on Guadalcanal were in serious danger. It was a concealed airfield. Japanese construction battalions had landed on Munda Point in late November 1942. Among the most skilled engineering crews in the world. Working only at night, they turned a coconut plantation into an airbase while American reconnaissance planes flew overhead, unaware of the transformation. Their method was clever. Each night they would pick a section of the grove, climb the palms, fasten steel cables between the crowns, and cut the trunks at the base. Suspended in the web of cables, the trees remained in place while bulldozers cleared coral beneath. By dawn, the canopy was lowered, perfectly restoring the illusion of untouched jungle. Native laborers scattered fresh fronds over disturbed ground, making the site invisible from 10,000 feet. For a week, American pilots flew over Munda and saw nothing but dense forest, while bombers photographed every inch of coastline without detecting the hidden runway. When the December 3 report suggested a concealed airfield, American officer William F. Bull Halsey immediately recognized the danger. Enemy fighters from Munda could escort bombers to Henderson Field and back, leaving Guadalcanal's troops under constant air threat. The next day, 9 B-17s from the 11th Bombardment Group took off at 6 a.m., each carrying 500-pound bombs. They easily located Munda. The fresh coral runway stood out against the jungle. At 20,000 feet, Bombardier Lieutenant James McCoy aligned the target in his bomb sight and released the load. 36 bombs hit in textbook fashion, throwing coral and steel matting into the air. McCoy reported direct hits across the runway. Certain it was destroyed, it wasn't. The next day's reconnaissance revealed fresh steel matting over the craters, the runway intact, and new camouflage covering aircraft shelters. Heavier raids followed. Dive bombers and torpedo planes replaced their torpedoes with massive bombs intended to cripple the runway. Pilots claimed the airfield was torn apart, fuel dumps burned for hours, and a hit on an ammunition cache sent flames 500 feet into the air. Yet the next reconnaissance flight showed the runway operational again, with enemy planes ready in their shelters. Through mid-December, the attacks became routine, but Japanese crews, reinforced by hundreds of Korean laborers, repaired the damage. Each night, stockpiled coral and hidden steel matting allowed them to fix craters within hours. Even a devastating Christmas Eve raid, in which 20 enemy planes were destroyed or damaged, failed to stop operations. By New Year's Eve, Japanese medium bombers were operating from Munda, despite 150 to 200 tons of bombs having been dropped in a single month. On December 30th, reports showed Munda had endured another 40 tons of bombs the previous day with no loss of operational capacity. Air raids alone were not working, so Halsey decided on a new tactic: naval gunfire. The plan called for a surface bombardment force to slip in at night, shell Munda with hundreds of rounds for an hour, and withdraw at full speed before Japanese aircraft could respond. This meant venturing deep into enemy-controlled waters, farther than any American surface force had gone since the start of the war. Rear Admiral Walden L. Ainsworth was assigned to lead Task Force Affirm, with 3 light cruisers Nashville, St. Louis, and Hellenian destroyers Fletcher and O'Bannon. 3 battleships and 4 destroyers under Rear Admiral Willis A. Lee would provide distant cover. The bombardment was timed to coincide with a major troop movement to Guadalcanal on January 4th, serving as both a diversion and a shield. On board the Nashville, Ainsworth studied the charts with his staff. Navigating to Munda meant threading through coral reefs, narrow passages, and confined waters. His assessment noted 2 major challenges: entering undetected, or at least preventing the enemy from knowing their exact movement, and withdrawing beyond the reach of land-based aircraft by daylight. While still under friendly air cover, on January 2nd, aboard the Louisville, Ainsworth's plan was finalized. Each cruiser would fire for 10 minutes along a 3-mile track at 18 knots, with each ship using nearly 1,100 6-inch rounds. The destroyers would add to the bombardment with 10 rounds per gun per minute from their 5-inch batteries. Navigation in the pitch darkness would rely on radar and one critical guide, the submarine Greyback, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Edward Stephen, which would surface exactly 2 miles northwest of Bonatetta Point to serve as a moving lighthouse. The Greyback was already en route, still recovering from an unusual medical emergency. Days earlier, a sailor's appendix had ruptured while submerged, and the pharmacist's mate had performed surgery on the wardroom table using spoons from the galley and pliers from the engine room in place of surgical tools. For spotting, Lieutenant Commander Dennis Crowley arranged for radar-equipped PBY Black Cats to orbit over Munda. Unlike cruiser floatplanes, these could loiter for hours, relaying corrections. Crowley personally flew preliminary missions on January 2nd and 3rd, harassing Munda while committing its landmarks to memory. The conference ended with orders for captains to study recognition silhouettes and approach routes. No radio transmissions. Toward the shore, no blinker signals, complete darkness, and total surprise. Crowley later wrote that this was the first naval bombardment of shore installations using the Navy's most advanced radar for both navigation and fire control, and the first time surface ships, submarines, and aircraft were coordinated in a night bombardment. 5 ships were heading toward a base that had already withstood 200 tons of bombs. At 8 p.m. on January 4th, southwest of the Russell Islands, Task Force Affirm split from its covering force and turned northwest into enemy waters. In column formation, Nashville led, followed by St. Louis, Helena and the destroyers Fletcher and O'Bannon, racing at 26 knots toward Munda Point, 200 miles into Japanese territory. The night was pitch black, with overcast skies hiding the stars and rain squalls, cutting visibility to almost nothing, ideal for a stealth approach or a disastrous grounding on a reef. In Nashville's pilot house, Captain Spanigal studied the SG radar screen, its ghostly green outlines marking islands and reefs. The new radar was their lifeline, with sonar constantly pinging for underwater hazards. The navigator checked positions every few minutes, matching radar echoes to charted locations. At 11 p.m., each cruiser launched a floatplane. The launches required brief flashes of light, a dangerous risk in these waters. The SOC Seagulls carried flares for emergencies and were to orbit behind Renova Island, ready to warn of enemy ships. 30 minutes later, the Black Cats were already over Munda, dropping 500-pound bombs and distracting the defenders. Japanese searchlights swept the skies, unaware that a column of warships was approaching below. At 12:25 a.m., Nashville's radar detected the Greyback surfaced exactly as planned. The submarine sent a challenge signal, and Nashville replied. The checkpoint was perfect. The column slowed to 18 knots for the final approach. As they rounded Bonatetta Point, tension rose. The Tokyo Express ran these waters nightly, and a chance encounter could ruin everything. Then the destroyer Fletcher reported a large vessel straight ahead, 4,000 to 5,000 yards out. Multiple crew confirmed the sighting, but the SG radar showed nothing. The radar operator stared at his empty scope, shaking his fist in frustration. Fletcher turned sharply to port, training torpedo tubes on the target. Strangely, the vessel seemed to turn with them, always keeping the same relative angle, impossible behavior for a real ship. The commander ordered torpedoes held. At 12:42 a.m., Nashville opened fire. 15 6-inch guns lit up the sea, and suddenly the enemy vanished. It was a shadow. Fletcher's Phantom ship had been their own silhouette projected onto haze. By Nashville's gunfire, when Nashville stopped firing at 1:13 a.m. and St. Louis began its bombardment, the Phantom returned, and Nashville experienced the same illusion, firing at what they thought was a torpedo boat. Intelligence later revealed the Japanese had suffered identical confusion during their bombardment of Guadalcanal in October, chasing phantom ships that didn't exist. But on this dark night off Munda, with guns roaring and adrenaline high, the illusions felt dangerously real. Worse, the muzzle flashes had exposed Task Force Affirm's position to every Japanese observer within 20 miles, costing them the element of surprise. Nashville pressed on along the firing course at 18 knots. The ships closed in on the target. The Japanese now knew they were there. Nashville's 15 guns fired together, sending 130-pound shells screaming through the darkness at 2,600 feet per second. Tracers carved glowing arcs against the black sky. The first salvo landed 13,400 yards away, ending in plumes of coral and fire. From 8,000 feet above Munda, the Black Cat spotter radioed. Up 500, no change in deflection. Nashville's gun crews adjusted their aim. The second salvo struck the runway. No change, came the next call. Captain Spanigal ordered rapid continuous fire. Nashville's turrets roared in sequence forward, aft. Forward again 15 shells, slamming into Munda every 7 seconds. From the destroyer's decks, the sight was remarkable. 6 separate salvos hanging in the air at once, each a cluster of orange tracers, curving toward the shore. An observer later wrote that it looked like she was playing a fiery hose across the enemy position. The fire control teams worked with precision, adjusting coordinates, and swinging turrets minutely. The Black Cat reported, "You're rocking them away, right up the beach. No shots going in water." Shells swept systematically over the airfield, runway, dispersal zones, and fuel dumps. Fires began small south of the runway, then grew larger. Japanese gunners responded with dull red tracers that fell well short of the ships. At 1:13 a.m., Nashville ceased fire, her barrels glowing hot after firing 853 rounds in 11 minutes. She accelerated to 25 knots, clearing the line for St. Louis. St. Louis' first shots overshot the runway, but her aim quickly improved. Soon, flames erupted along the shoreline, possibly from delayed fuse rounds or from her shells, striking fuel stores. The blaze spread rapidly, jumping from one building to another. St. Louis continued pouring shells into the firestorm, with nearly 2/3 of her rounds striking the target. Overhead, observers saw more Japanese guns joining in, their red tracers meeting the Americans' orange in a chaotic light display reflected in burning fuel tanks. 10 minutes later, Helena began her bombardment. Her first salvo fell short, the second hit home, and the spotter's voice came alive with praise. "Beautiful, excellent, excellent." A massive explosion lit the night, visible 20 miles away. The Black Cat reported a large blast on the hill north of the runway. At 1:40 a.m., Fletcher and O'Bannon charged forward, their 5-inch guns hammering the shore in a rapid rhythm. Though their shells were smaller, the sheer rate of fire devastated revetments, beaches, and auxiliary targets. Small fires merged into roaring infernos. 10 minutes later, the ceasefire order came. In 48 minutes, over 4,000 shells had been fired. Munda burned behind them as Task Force Affirm headed south into the night, confident they were out of reach of a counterattack. They were wrong. By 7 a.m., the task force was 30 miles south of the Russell Islands and appeared safe. Wildcats from Henderson Field arrived overhead, and the ships slowed to 28 knots. 2 hours later, the bombardment group rejoined the rest of Task Force 67 cruisers Honolulu, Louisville, Columbia, and the New Zealand light cruiser, Achilles, along with 3 destroyers. The combined formation slowed to 15 knots to recover. Floatplanes. Some ships stayed at full readiness. Others eased to Condition 3. On Honolulu, battery drills were underway, and her floatplanes were making practice dives. Everything seemed routine. Then 6 IHE-99 dive bombers appeared, approaching from the direction of Henderson Field at 12,000 feet. The sun's position perfectly backlit them, and radar operators assumed they were friendly. They looked like wildcats in the glare, and the presence of a passing PBY reinforced the illusion. The Japanese pilots had planned this deception well. The lead bombers dived at 75 degrees before anyone realized the truth. Honolulu began turning to port as the first bombs fell. 3 near misses straddled her 125 yards to port, to 2 starboard throwing towering geysers of water into the air. Her anti-aircraft guns fired only a single ineffective round each before the enemy was overhead. Behind her, Achilles never had a chance. Her crew had also mistaken the formation for wildcats. Only when the planes broke formation into attack dives did they realize the danger. Just 3 of her 20mm guns were manned as the attack began. The third bomber in the formation dove through scattered gunfire and released its load. 2 550-pound bombs struck directly on the roof of Achilles' No. 3 turret. The explosion was devastating. The right side of the turret, made of 1-inch plate, was blown into the sea. The roof, also 1 inch thick, split into 2 halves, one thrown under the quarterdeck. The other flipped into the air and landed upside down back on the turret. 9 men were killed instantly. The 20mm gun mounted atop the turret was hurled onto the quarterdeck, still attached to half the roof by a single bolt. Columbia and Louisville opened fire as the attacking plane passed overhead. Louisville's gunners hit one Aichi at 800 yards, tearing into its fuselage until it lost altitude and crashed. Another bomber came in low from astern, strafing, but concentrated 20mm fire drove it away. The remaining planes turned toward St. Louis and Helena, about 4,000 yards distant. Both cruisers unleashed intense anti-aircraft fire, forcing one attacker to release wildly before crashing near St. Louis. Another was brought down by Helena's guns. O'Bannon reported 5 planes burning in the water. 6 minutes after it began, the attack was over. Achilles' turret was still ablaze, but damaged. Teams quickly put out the fire. She kept her place in the column, never losing speed. When Task Force Affirm reached Espiritu Santo on January 8, the crews felt certain of victory. They had seen Munda burning and heard the spotters' enthusiastic reports. Admiral Ainsworth confidently wrote that reports from the Catalina over Munda indicated that bombardment had been successful. Then the reconnaissance photos arrived. Only 18 hours after the attack, Japanese fighters were operating from Munda. The runway showed fresh repairs where craters had been filled. Dispersal areas were restored, anti-aircraft positions manned. The 4,000 shells, the phantom ship encounters, and the dangerous run through enemy waters had brought less than a single day's disruption. Worse, the Japanese were building more. By mid-January, construction crews were nearly finished with a second airfield at Villa Stanmore on Kolombangara Island. Directly across Kula Gulf from Munda, 2 airfields in mutual support meant double the threat to Guadalcanal. Bombs kept falling, and the repairs kept coming. Between Munda's discovery and mid-January, American aircraft flew over 90 missions against it. Nothing worked. Stockpiles of coral fill, steel matting, and construction equipment hidden throughout the jungle allowed the Japanese to repair a cratered runway in just 4 hours. SINCPAC's assessment was direct. Ship bombardment caused only temporary damage to airfields. But Halsey had no choice. Every night, Japanese barges moved between the islands. In December, Coastwatchers counted 28 barges in a single convoy through Diamond Narrows. The Vela garrison had grown from 400 to 4,000 troops. On January 19th, new orders arrived: strike Villa Stanmore, disrupt the supply runs, and hit the troops while buying as much time as possible. Ammunition shortages forced Ainsworth to take a smaller force. Cruisers Nashville and Helena. Destroyers Nicholas de Haven, Radford, and O'Bannon. The confined waters of Kula Gulf would make the operation even more dangerous than Munda. The ships would have to fire while heading into a trap. From the start, the mission went wrong. Japanese reconnaissance spotted Task Force Affirm southwest of Guadalcanal. For 7 hours, enemy planes shadowed them, staying just beyond the reach of American fighters. The element of surprise was already gone. At 8 p.m., the bombardment group turned north into darkness and rain. After midnight, 3 aircraft appeared with full navigation lights. White wingtips and tails Mitsubishi bombers circling O'Bannon and flashing the letter U in Morse code. For more than an hour, they orbited, seemingly unsure whether they had found friend or foe. They held an ideal attack position, but never released their bombs. Nashville turned onto the bombardment course, and Japanese searchlights immediately swept upward from Villa, searching for the black cat spotters. Nashville opened fire, with Helena following close behind, their shells striking with near-perfect accuracy. De Haven soon joined, and the night exploded with noise and flame. Commander Charles Tolman later recalled massive fires towering above the palm trees and admitted they had assumed the first shots had caused the blaze, only to learn later that the cruisers had ignited it. The fire spread to a 300-yard square area, ammunition detonated, and fuel drums exploded. For 20 minutes, Villa Stanmore burned like a torch, casting its glow across Kula Gulf. 2 months had passed since the earlier burning of the plantations. In that time, repairs, reinforcements, and Japanese strength had grown. By March 1943, Admiral Merrill led a new strike force, north 3 cruisers for Villa Stanmore, and 4 destroyers for Munda. The plan was to set both bases ablaze at the same time. On March 5, under clear skies and calm seas, the approach went perfectly, with no enemy contact. Merrill's cruisers, Montpelier, Cleveland, and Denver slipped into Kula Gulf just after midnight. Destroyers speeding ahead. Then Montpelier's radar operator reported a contact at bearing 234, range 14,300 yards, exactly where Sansipa Island should be, but 9,000 yards short. After watching the blip split into 2, he identified them as enemy ships heading north. The task force's radars locked on, and gun directors swung silently in the dark. As the range closed, Montpelier fired first, with Cleveland and Denver concentrating on the second target. The 6th salvo hit, igniting flames from the enemy's aft turret before a midship explosion sent fire soaring 150 feet high. In the brief light, Cleveland's lookouts identified a large destroyer with a white band on its stack. The destroyer Waller had been tracking the same ship. Commander Frost estimated its speed at 24 knots, and launched 5 torpedoes as cruiser shells struck. The damaged destroyer turned into their path, and 1 torpedo hit amidships in what Merrill later called a colossal explosion without sound or flash, so bright it was seen 25 miles away, yet strangely muted by distance and wind. The destroyer broke in half and vanished into the sea, leaving only burning oil. The lead Japanese vessel continued north, firing sporadically but without coordination. American shells pursued her for 4 miles until radar showed her dead in the water, burning weakly. Merrill ordered Waller to finish her off, but before the destroyer could close for a torpedo strike, the enemy ship rolled over and sank. In just 10 minutes, 2 Japanese destroyers were sent to the bottom without a single American casualty. Still, the bombardment of Villa Stanmore would now face an alerted defense, and more Japanese ships were racing south. By May 1943, the bombardment had become routine but largely ineffective. Munda and Villa Stanmore endured thousands of shells, burned through the night, and were operating again by morning. Japanese engineers had turned runway repair into an almost automatic process. American commanders knew the truth only ground troops could finish the job. Until they were ready, the Navy would keep striking. Admiral Ainsworth assembled the largest force yet. 15 ships. 4 cruisers would hit Villa Stanmore. 1 cruiser and 2 destroyers would target Munda, and 3 converted destroyers would lay mines in Kula Gulf's approaches to disrupt supply runs. On May 13th, under clear skies and with no enemy contact, the Americans opened fire at 1 a.m., unleashing 10,000 shells in an hour. Munda was burning within minutes. 2 minutes into the bombardment, disaster struck Nashville when an explosion erupted. From turret 3 to powder charges had ignited prematurely. The ship kept firing with her remaining guns. Meanwhile, the mine layers planted 252 mines in 3 neat rows along Columbus coast. creating 8,400 yards of hidden explosives. Within 2 days, Coastwatchers reported 3 Japanese destroyers sunk after hitting mines. At dawn, Japanese search planes found the task force. By 1 p.m., Henderson Field radar detected incoming aircraft, and 102 American fighters scrambled the largest defensive air effort in South Pacific history. 26 Zeros dove through, but within minutes, 17 Japanese planes were falling. In flames, American losses were 5 planes and 3 pilots. The Japanese had failed to inflict serious damage. Even so, an official assessment admitted that such large-scale bombardments, consuming nearly 10,000 rounds, were not justified by the limited results. Within hours, both airfields were operational again. On July 2nd, American soldiers and Marines landed on New Georgia. For 5 weeks they fought through jungle, disease, and fierce resistance. On August 5, 1943, the 14th Corps overran Munda's defenders. The airfield that had resisted destruction from sea and air finally fell to ground forces. Within 2 weeks, American aircraft were flying from its runway. The 6-month struggle was over, and the path to Rabaul was open.